Hi and welcome to Visual Art Photography Tutorials. Today on Neighborhood Photographer, it's all about bokeh. I readily admit this whole image is rather frightening with the incredibly bad light, but I'm trying to show you what bokeh is, and bokeh are those round lights, those blurry, diffuse lights in the background. From a restaurant actually, with Christmas lights, and that's what bokeh is. So today on part one of bokeh, we're going to take a look at what bokeh is. I think we already see that, and we're going to see how you can create bokeh in camera and also in Photoshop. So this is part one of bokeh on Visual Art Photography Tutorials.
I do want to say a big thank you to all of you who have subscribed to the channel, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, and you'll get early notifications on all newly uploaded videos.
So this is actually the restaurant that was in back of me, and if you try to create bokeh at this point, you wouldn't get very much. So what we're doing is we're shooting at f4, by the way. I have a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and right now it's at 70 millimeters, okay? So if I take the focus ring and try to get it out of focus, it does, but it really doesn't create great bokeh. So let's put it back in focus, all right, or close to it, and let's bring this up to 200 millimeters, all right? Now out of focus, and watch the bokeh up here. Watch that. Look at this. And you get this incredible bokeh effect. So shallow depth of field, f4, and in this case 200 millimeters creates incredible bokeh from something that is really something like that. Okay? I don't have my glasses on, so I don't know if it's really in focus, but you get the idea. So the first thing you're going to notice is that I'm using a black background. You don't have to. The reason why I'm using a black background today is because in bokeh part 2, when I'm going to be showing you more creative ways to use bokeh, the black background is going to come in handy. But again, you don't need to use a black background. Now, your aperture should be on minimum aperture, whether it's an f2 lens or f2.8 or f4. In this case, it's an f4 lens, so you want to put it on a wide open aperture so that you can have shallow depth of field. And then in this case, we're using Christmas lights. Doesn't have to be Christmas lights, but hey, 'tis the season, why not? And they're colorful and they're going to make interesting bokeh. So I'm bunching them up in front of the lens like this, and I'm going to turn the focus ring so that it's out of focus, completely out of focus. And then I'm going to move the lights from farther away. I'm going to bring them in closer. And when you get the effect you want, you snap the picture. And voila, bokeh. See the bokeh effect? And now we're going to move them closer. Look at that. Look at that bokeh. And of course, in post, maybe you're using Photoshop or some other type of software, you can really pop these colors and take away some of that brightness, you know. By the way, I'm shooting with 24 to 105 millimeter lens set at 105 millimeters, aperture f4. And you can also unbunch the lights and create something a little different, like this.
So let me just say right off the top that personally I prefer to use in-camera bokeh. I think it's a little bit, it glows a little bit more, has a little bit more vibrancy to it. But the nice thing about creating it in Photoshop is that you have an endless amount of control, which as photographers we tend to like having control over what we do. So you can do a lot of interesting things with bokeh in Photoshop. So that's why we should go through it, and that's what we're going to do right now. So the first thing we have to do is select our brush tool by pressing B or going over to the panel over here and selecting brush. And then we go across screen over here and bring up the panel, the brushes panel. Now this is the really important part because this is how we're going to make our bokeh brush. All right. Now right now I have the soft round brush selected, and we're going to change all of that, and we're just going to move this hardness slider over to 100, and you can see the change down here. And the spacing, we're going to space it. Now this is to taste. As usual, it's to the way you want it, and I think I want my spacing for this particular tutorial to be around 151%, but you can make it anything you want. Shape dynamics, that's important. We have size jitter. Now watch this down here as I change the size jitter, okay? If it's down to 0, they're all the same size. And if you go over here, then you have a great deal of difference in the size of each of those bokeh balls. And so I'm going to set it to around 53, but you can, again, set it to the way you want it. Scattering, that's important as well. If you don't scatter at all, everything kind of goes in a line. And if you scatter, then it goes 1,000%. It goes all over the place. I don't really want it to be that crazy today, so I'm going to set the scatter at around 301. That'll be fine. And then, because we're going to have fun with this, and it's not that you would necessarily use different color bokeh, but for this exercise, let's do it. Let's hit color dynamics. And we'll choose foreground, background jitter. Now what that means is, if I had set it down here, I'm going to set my foreground and my background color to different colors. You're going to see that in a moment. If I have it down here, there's not going to be much difference in color. But if I set it up here, and for this exercise we're going to do that to 100%, you're going to see that the bokeh turns out to be different colors. So that's the way you set up your brush, okay? Or at least that's one way of setting up your brush. Let's go over to the foreground panel and select, let's select a blue for this one, okay? Something like that. And for the background, press on that, and we'll select a bright red. So now we have blue in the foreground, red in the background, and we are going to start having some fun. Now, you can change your brush size by hitting on a Mac Control option and then pressing, and then you can see that you can make it big or you can make your brush really small. It's a nice little shortcut. I really like this one. And you can already see that the brush, because we set it before in the brushes panel, we set it to a hardness of 100, so it's nice and clear. So let's set it to this for this. Okay. Now we're going to create a new layer, a blank layer, above this white layer, and let's see what happens. Look at that. Different colors, different sizes. Okay. Now let's say you want to make another layer, and you want the bokeh to be bigger. Control Option again. Let's make it a bit bigger. Okay. Now bokeh, when we created it in camera, you notice that it wasn't really this sharp. It was a little bit more blurry. So we can change that too. I just got rid of this top layer. Take a look at the bottom layer. And we go to Filter and Blur and Gaussian Blur. And again, this is the way you want it to taste. You can have it hardly blurry at all. You can bring the blur way up. I prefer for this to be somewhere around something like that. We have it at 8 for this one. And then on the bigger layer, we can set that to anything you want. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Let's make this one a little different. Let's just make this 12. Make the bottom layer visible. And there you have your bokeh. Now, how does that translate onto an image? Well, you know something, multicolored bokeh in an image, it depends on what you're trying to do. But let's go to an image over here, a nighttime scene. And let's create some bokeh for this. But for this one, let's just make it white bokeh, okay? So hit the D key to set everything to black and white, and then hit the foreground, and we're going to make that white. So now our brush is completely white. We'll make a layer above all of this, a transparent layer, and we'll make our brush just a little bit smaller, and we'll spread out a little bokeh up here. Okay? Just like that, let's say. And then we'll hit Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we'll set it to That's fine. 12. Now here's the key. Change the blend mode from normal to soft light. And you've got some interesting things going on there. And you can use this with this kind of an image with people. It's great. Put this in the background. All kinds of different things. And finally, here's what I think is a really practical use of bokeh. I find it really works well for macro photography or for close-up photography. And in this shot, we're going to add a little bokeh, and I think it's going to help the background. And the background's kind of nice, you know. I mean, this was a late fall shot, and it's kind of brownish, but it has a certain mood to it. But the bokeh is just going to pick it up a little bit. So let's create that blank layer. Okay. And now I've set my brush size a little bit larger, okay, like that. Everything else is the same, the scattering, all that sort of thing. So let's try to put some bokeh in here and see what happens. Okay. Now, right here, it doesn't look very good, but let's blur it a little bit. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And we're going to blur it up about 50% this time. Or 50, let's say about 56. All right, now let's change the blend mode from normal to soft light. And look at that. It's almost like there are water droplets in back that are out of focus, and you've got that diffused look. Doesn't that add something? That's before, and that's after. Okay, if those bokeh balls are a little bit too much for you, you can always just back off the opacity a little bit. Look at that. Just back it off a bit. And it really looks like there are water droplets in back that are out of focus. And that's a nice way to use bokeh, and it was all done in Photoshop. So there you have it. Part 1 of bokeh, how we can create it in camera and also in Photoshop. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Try it out. It's lots of fun. Now in part 2 of bokeh, coming up early in the new year, I'll be featuring different ways to use bokeh, very, very creative ways, things that you may or may not have thought of. That's in part 2 coming up in the early part of next year. Until next time, I'm Ray Scott, reminding you that it's not what you see, it's how you see it. And I'll see you soon.